Lila Montgomery stood in her parents' pristine dining room, her perfectly manicured finger pointed at the man she'd married 5 years ago, calling him a pathetic loser who would never amount to anything, humiliating him in front of her mother and father before announcing she was dumping her husband to marry his boss, the powerful Derek Walsh. What Lila didn't know was that the company they both worked for, the multi-billion-dollar corporation that employed thousands, actually belonged to her husband, not his boss. The man she'd just destroyed in front of everyone owned everything, controlled everything, and what he was about to do to her and the boss she thought would save her would leave everyone who witnessed it absolutely shocked. But how did a woman throw away a billionaire without even knowing it? What had driven her to such cruelty toward the one man who'd given her everything? And when the truth finally exploded into the open, what kind of devastating revenge would a humiliated husband unleash on the wife who'd betrayed him and the employee who'd stolen her away? The crystal chandelier above the Montgomery family dining table cast elegant shadows across the white linen tablecloth. But the beauty of the setting couldn't mask the ugliness of what was happening. Lila Montgomery's voice cut through the air like shattered glass, each word designed to wound, to humiliate, to destroy the man sitting quietly at the end of the table. Her husband, Thomas Reed, sat with his hands folded in his lap, his expression unreadable as his wife of 5 years systematically dismantled him in front of her parents. "Look at him, Mother," Lila said, gesturing toward Thomas with disgust dripping from every syllable. 5 years I've waited for him to be something, anything other than a nobody. 5 years of watching him go to that office every single day, coming home with nothing to show for it. Do you know what his title is? Associate. Just associate. Not even senior associate. He's been stuck in the same position since before we got married, spinning his wheels, going absolutely nowhere while I've climbed the ladder." Eleanor Montgomery, Lila's mother, shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes darting between her daughter and son-in-law. Beside her, Gerald Montgomery remained silent, his jaw tight with an emotion Thomas couldn't quite read. The older man had always been measured in his responses, careful in his judgments, but tonight something seemed different in his expression. Something almost sad. Thomas had known this moment was coming. He'd watched it building for months, seen the way Lila had grown more distant, more contemptuous, her late nights at the office becoming more frequent, her excuses growing thinner. He'd watched her fall for Derek Walsh, his supposed boss, the man everyone at Titanium Industries believed ran the company. Derek, with his expensive suits and his corner office and his company car, had swept Lila off her feet with displays of power that Thomas had deliberately chosen not to exercise himself. "He's weak, Father," Lila continued, turning her attention to Gerald. "I married a man I thought had potential, but he's shown me nothing but mediocrity. Meanwhile, Derek Walsh has shown me what a real man looks like, what real success looks like. Derek is going places. Derek has a future. Derek can give me the life I deserve, not this pathetic existence of pinching pennies and pretending we're happy." Thomas finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "Is that really what you think, Lila? That these 5 years have been about me failing you?" "Don't you dare turn this around," Lila snapped, her face flushing with anger. "Don't you dare try to make yourself the victim here. I've sacrificed my best years waiting for you to become something worth being married to. I've stood by you while you stayed stagnant, stayed invisible, stayed absolutely nothing. Well, I'm done. I'm done being married to a loser who can't even get a promotion. I'm done pretending that you're enough." Eleanor cleared her throat softly. "Lila, dear, perhaps we should discuss this privately. This seems rather hasty." "Hasty?" Lila laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. "Mother, I've been dying slowly in this marriage for years. There's nothing hasty about finally admitting that I made a mistake. I should have listened to you both when you said Thomas wasn't established enough, wasn't from the right kind of family, wasn't the kind of man who could provide the lifestyle I was raised to expect." Thomas remembered those early days when Gerald and Eleanor had indeed expressed reservations about their daughter marrying someone they perceived as beneath her social standing. Thomas had come from a working-class background, had built everything from nothing, though the Montgomerys had never known the truth. He'd kept his ownership of Titanium Industries absolutely secret, operating through a complex corporate structure that allowed him to work within his own company as if he were just another employee. He'd wanted to experience life at ground level, wanted to understand his workforce, wanted to meet people who valued him for who he was rather than what he owned. He'd met Lila at a company mixer, had been drawn to her confidence and her ambition. She'd been working in the marketing department, making a name for herself with innovative campaigns and aggressive strategies. Thomas had fallen for her drive, her passion, her refusal to settle for anything less than excellence. What he hadn't realized was that her ambition would eventually turn into a weapon aimed directly at his heart. "Derek has already proposed," Lila announced, pulling a ring box from her purse and opening it to reveal a massive diamond that caught the chandelier light. "He gave this to me last week. He wants to marry me, wants to build a life with me, wants to show me off to the world instead of hiding me away like some shameful secret. Derek is a vice president, Father. He makes real money. He has real power. He's everything Thomas isn't, and everything Thomas will never be." Gerald Montgomery finally spoke, his voice heavy with something that sounded like disappointment. "Lila, I think you should be very careful about the decisions you're making tonight. Sometimes things are not what they appear to be." "What's that supposed to mean?" Lila demanded. "Are you taking his side? After everything I've told you about how miserable I've been, you're actually defending him?" "I'm not defending anyone," Gerald said carefully. "I'm simply suggesting that perhaps you don't have all the information you think you have. Perhaps there are circumstances you're not aware of, details that might change your perspective." Thomas had always liked Gerald, had always sensed that the older man saw more than he let on. They'd had several conversations over the years, quiet discussions about business and philosophy and the nature of success. And Thomas had sometimes wondered if Gerald suspected the truth. Now, watching the older man's face, Thomas was almost certain that Gerald had figured it out, or at least figured out that something didn't add up about his son-in-law's position in the company. "There's nothing that could change my mind," Lila said coldly. "I've made my decision. I'm dumping my husband, I'm marrying Derek, and I'm finally going to have the life I've always deserved. Thomas can sign the divorce papers tomorrow, can pack his things and move out of my apartment, can disappear back into whatever mediocre existence he crawled out of. I'm done with him, completely and utterly done." Thomas stood slowly, pushing his chair back from the table. He looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw a stranger wearing Lila's face. The woman he'd married had been ambitious but kind, driven but compassionate. This woman standing before him, dumping her husband with such casual cruelty, calling him a loser in front of her parents, planning to marry his boss without a second thought. This woman had been created by his own choices, by his decision to hide who he really was. He'd thought he was testing her love, seeing if she could value him without the trappings of wealth and power. Instead, he'd created a situation where she'd grown to resent him, to see him as a failure, to seek validation in the arms of a man who was, in reality, his employee. Derek Walsh was ambitious and competent. Thomas had promoted him to vice president himself, but Derek was also calculating and opportunistic, willing to betray his employer by sleeping with the employer's wife, not knowing that the quiet associate he dismissed in the hallways was actually the man who signed his paychecks. "I'll sign the papers," Thomas said quietly. "If this is really what you want, Lila, if you're absolutely certain that I'm a loser who will never amount to anything, if you're convinced that Derek Walsh is your path to happiness, then I won't stand in your way." Lila's eyes flashed with triumph. "Finally, something intelligent comes out of your mouth. Yes, that's exactly what I want. I want you out of my life, out of my apartment, out of my future. I want to marry Derek and forget I ever wasted 5 years on you." "Then consider it done," Thomas said. "I'll have my lawyers draw up the paperwork. You'll have everything you're legally entitled to from our marriage. And I wish you and Derek every happiness." Eleanor looked stricken, her hand reaching out as if to stop Thomas from leaving, but Gerald placed his own hand over his wife's, holding her back. The older man's eyes met Thomas's, and in that moment, Thomas saw understanding there, saw recognition, saw something that looked almost like an apology. Thomas walked out of the Montgomery family dining room with his head high, his heart broken, but his resolve strengthening with every step. He'd given Lila every chance to see him, to value him, to love him for who he was rather than what he could provide. She'd failed that test spectacularly, and now it was time for the consequences of her choice to unfold. He thought about the board meeting scheduled for Monday morning, the annual shareholders gathering where the true owner of Titanium Industries would finally step out of the shadows and reveal himself. He thought about Derek Walsh's face when he realized who he'd been dismissing as a nobody for years. He thought about Lila's face when she understood what she'd thrown away. As he stepped out into the cool night air, Thomas pulled out his phone and called his head attorney. "Richard," he said when the man answered, "it's time. I want you to prepare everything for Monday's meeting. Full reveal, no more shadows, no more pretending, and I need divorce papers drawn up immediately. My wife is dumping her husband for my vice president, and she doesn't know that her loser husband actually owns everything she's been working for." Richard was silent for a moment, then sighed deeply. "I tried to warn you this could happen, Thomas. When you insisted on that undercover arrangement, I told you it was dangerous to hide your identity from your wife." "You were right," Thomas admitted, "but now we move forward. Now we show everyone exactly who I am and what I control. Now the real story begins." He hung up the phone and walked toward his modest sedan, the car he'd deliberately chosen to maintain his cover as a struggling associate. In his private garage across town sat a collection of vehicles worth more than most people's houses, but he'd never driven them, never flaunted them, never given Lila any indication that her husband was anything other than what he appeared to be. That had been his mistake, he realized now. He'd been so committed to his test, so determined to find authentic love, that he'd created the perfect conditions for Lila to develop contempt for him. The drive back to the apartment he shared with Lila felt surreal. In a few days, he'd never see this place again. He'd let Lila keep it, along with everything else she wanted from their marriage. Money meant nothing to him now. What mattered was that he'd learned a crucial lesson about human nature, about his wife's character, about the price of secrets and the cost of pretending to be less than you are. When he arrived home, he began packing his belongings methodically, carefully separating his life from Lila's. In the back of his closet, hidden behind his work clothes, was a garment bag containing suits that cost more than he supposedly made in a month. He'd never worn them, never even taken them out of the bag in Lila's presence. Now he pulled them out, laying them on the bed, preparing for his transformation from invisible associate to revealed billionaire. His phone buzzed with a text message from Derek Walsh. "Lila told me she broke the news to you tonight. No hard feelings, Reed. Sometimes the better man wins. Hope you land on your feet. I'll make sure she's happy. Something you obviously couldn't do." Thomas stared at the message, reading the casual dismissal, the subtle mockery, the complete absence of remorse from a man who deliberately pursued another man's wife. Derek Walsh had no idea he was texting the person who could end his career with a single phone call, who could destroy his reputation with a single revelation, who owned every desk and every computer and every square foot of office space that Derek believed made him powerful. He typed a response, keeping his tone neutral. "I'm sure you will, Derek. See you at the office on Monday. Should be an interesting day." Derek's response came quickly. "Won't be awkward, will it? I mean, you reporting to me while I'm married to your ex? If it's too weird, I can probably arrange a transfer for you. Maybe something in the basement. Out of sight." The cruelty was casual, almost playful, as if Derek found the entire situation amusing. Thomas realized that this was who Derek really was beneath the professional veneer, beneath the vice president Polish. Derek Walsh was a man who enjoyed dominance, who took pleasure in defeating rivals, who saw other people as obstacles or tools rather than human beings deserving of respect. "I'll be fine," Thomas typed back. "Actually, I think Monday is going to be one of the most memorable days of my career. Possibly yours too." He turned off his phone and finished packing, loading his car with the belongings he wanted to keep. The rest could stay for Lila. He took one last look around the apartment they'd shared, remembering the early days when they'd been happy, when she'd loved him or at least loved who she thought he was. Those memories felt distant now, like they belonged to different people living different lives. Thomas drove to his real home, the penthouse condo he'd purchased under a corporate entity, the place where he'd never brought Lila, because it would have revealed too much. The doorman greeted him with familiar respect. "Welcome home, Mr. Reed. Will you be staying tonight?" "I'll be staying permanently now, Marcus," Thomas said, using the doorman's name as he always did. "The experiment is over." The penthouse was exactly as he'd left it, pristine and expensive, and utterly empty of the life he'd been pretending to live. Thomas poured himself a drink and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city lights, thinking about what Monday would bring. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. All the major shareholders would be there, all the vice presidents and department heads, everyone who mattered at Titanium Industries. Derek Walsh would be there, basking in his perceived power, unaware that the ground was about to shift beneath his feet. Lila wouldn't be in the meeting, but word would spread through the company within minutes, and he imagined her hearing the news from a colleague, her face going pale as she realized what her loser husband actually was. Gerald Montgomery called as Thomas was finishing his drink. "Thomas," the older man said without preamble, "I think I owe you an apology." "You don't owe me anything, Gerald," Thomas replied. "You weren't the one calling me a loser tonight." "No, but I didn't stop her either. I should have, but I wanted to see if you'd defend yourself, if you'd tell her the truth." "When you didn't, when you just accepted her cruelty and walked away, I realized you were testing her, testing all of us, really." Thomas was quiet for a moment, surprised that Gerald had read the situation so accurately. "How long have you known?" "About 2 years, Gerald admitted. "I have friends on the Titanium Industries board. They mentioned the owner was someone young, someone brilliant, someone who'd built the company from nothing and then disappeared into his own workforce to understand it from the inside. When they described him, I recognized you. The way you talked about business, the insights you had, the perspective you brought to our conversations, it didn't match your supposed position. I put the pieces together." "Did you tell Eleanor? Did you tell Lila?" "No," Gerald said heavily. "I thought perhaps you'd reveal yourself when the time was right, that you had your reasons for the secrecy. I never imagined my daughter would respond to your test by dumping her husband so cruelly. I'm ashamed of her, Thomas, ashamed of the values she's revealed, ashamed that Eleanor and I somehow raised a woman who could treat another human being with such contempt." "She doesn't know what she doesn't know," Thomas said. "I created this situation by hiding who I was. I wanted to know if she could love me without the money and power. I got my answer." "What will you do now?" Gerald asked quietly. "On Monday, I reveal myself at the board meeting," Thomas said. "Derek Walsh will discover that the man whose wife he stole actually owns the company he works for. Lila will discover that the loser she dumped for his boss is actually the boss of his boss of his boss. Everyone will discover that I've been hiding in plain sight for years." "And then?" Gerald pressed. "What happens to Derek? What happens to Lila?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "Derek will be fired, of course. Not for pursuing Lila, though that was unprofessional enough. But I've been documenting his behavior for months. The way he treats subordinates, the way he takes credit for other people's work, the way he manipulates situations to his advantage. Derek Walsh is good at looking successful, but he's not actually good at his job. He'll be gone by Monday afternoon. And my daughter? Lila made her choice based on false information," Thomas said. "She chose what she thought was power and success over what she thought was mediocrity and failure. When she discovers the truth, she'll have to live with the knowledge that she dumped a billionaire to marry an unemployed executive who betrayed his employer. That's punishment enough. I won't take any action against her directly. The natural consequences of her decision will be devastating without any intervention from me." Gerald was silent for a long moment. "You're a better man than she deserves, Thomas. I'm sorry she couldn't see that." "I'm sorry I didn't let her see it," Thomas replied. "I thought I was being noble, testing her love, but really I was being unfair. You can't judge someone for failing a test they don't know they're taking." After he hung up with Gerald, Thomas sat in the darkness of his penthouse, thinking about the different versions of himself he'd inhabited over the past 5 years. There was Thomas Reed the billionaire, the self-made success story who'd built Titanium Industries from a one-room startup to a multi-billion-dollar corporation. There was Thomas Reed the associate, the invisible employee who blended into the workforce and learned how his company actually functioned. And there was Thomas Reed, the husband, the man who'd loved Lila enough to hide himself completely, only to discover that she couldn't love what she could see. Monday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of perfect autumn day that promised either new beginnings or devastating endings, depending on your perspective. Thomas dressed in one of his expensive suits for the first time in years, the fabric feeling foreign against his skin after so long in department store business casual. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. This was the version of Thomas Reed that no one at Titanium Industries, except the board members, had ever seen. The version that commanded respect and wielded power without apology. His driver brought the car around, a sleek black Mercedes that made a statement before he even stepped out of it. As they pulled up to the Titanium Industries headquarters, Thomas saw several employees doing double takes, clearly not recognizing him, but sensing that someone important had arrived. The building rose 60 stories above the city, all glass and steel and architectural ambition. A monument to everything Thomas had built and everything Lila had dismissed as beyond her husband's reach. The private elevator took him directly to the 60th floor, where the executive offices and the main boardroom were located. His assistant, Catherine, was waiting when the doors opened, her eyes widening as she saw him. Catherine was one of the few people who knew the truth about Thomas's dual identity, and she'd been maintaining his cover for years, playing along with the fiction that he was just another associate while actually managing his schedule as the company's owner. "They're all assembled, Mr. Reed," Catherine said formally, dropping the casual facade she'd maintained for so long. "Mr. Walsh arrived early. He seems quite pleased with himself this morning." Thomas smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure he does. Has word spread about my personal situation?" "The gossip chain is already active," Catherine confirmed. "Several people saw Ms. Montgomery, celebrating with Mr. Walsh in the executive lounge last night. They were announcing their engagement. She was showing off her ring and telling people she'd finally escaped her mediocre marriage to upgrade to someone worthy of her." The words stung even though Thomas had expected them. Lila was already rewriting their history, painting him as an anchor she'd heroically cast off, presenting Derek as her salvation. By tomorrow, that narrative would be in ruins, but today it was spreading through the company unchallenged. "Let's not keep them waiting," Thomas said, straightening his tie and preparing for the performance of his lifetime. The boardroom was packed when he entered, every seat filled with the men and women who'd built Titanium Industries alongside him, who'd known his secret and protected it, who'd watched his undercover experiment with varying degrees of concern and admiration. At the far end of the table sat Derek Walsh, looking confident and powerful in his vice president role, completely unaware that his entire world was about to collapse. The seat at the head of the table, the chairman's seat, sat empty and waiting. Thomas walked the length of the room in complete silence, every eye following him, confusion written on some faces and knowing anticipation on others. Derek Walsh's expression changed from confusion to irritation as this unknown executive crossed into his territory. "Excuse me," Derek said sharply, "but this is a closed board meeting. Unless you have clearance to be here, you need to leave." Thomas reached the head of the table and placed his hands on the chairman's chair, looking directly at Derek Walsh with an expression that made the other man shift uncomfortably. "Derek," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying through the silent room, "I have more than clearance to be here. I own here. I own this chair, this room, this building, and every single asset of Titanium Industries, including, until very recently, your loyalty." The color drained from Derek's face as recognition hit him. "Reed?" he whispered, his confident posture crumbling. "Thomas Reed? But you're an associate. You work on the 14th floor. You report to me." "I've never reported to you, Derek," Thomas said, his voice hardening. "You report to me. You've always reported to me. Every promotion you've received, every raise you've enjoyed, every privilege you've exercised as vice president came from me. And every unprofessional decision you've made, every cruel comment you've delivered, every moment of disloyalty you've demonstrated, I've witnessed and documented." Thomas pulled out the chairman's chair and sat down, instantly transforming from the invisible associate Derek had dismissed for years into the commanding presence of a man who controlled billions. For those of you who don't know me in this capacity, Thomas addressed the room, my name is Thomas Reed, and I'm the founder, owner, and chairman of Titanium Industries. For the past 5 years, I've been operating within my own company as a regular employee, experiencing the corporate culture from the ground level, understanding how my decisions impact the workforce, learning what actually happens when policies I create get filtered down through the hierarchy. Several board members nodded, clearly having known this and supported his decision. Others looked shocked, clearly having believed that the chairman was someone who simply never came to the office. Derek Walsh looked like he might be sick, his face pale and his hands gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles were white. During my time undercover, Thomas continued, I married a woman named Lila Montgomery, now working in our marketing department. I deliberately maintained my cover with her, wanting to know if she could value me for who I was rather than what I owned. Last night, she answered that question definitively by dumping her husband in front of her parents, calling me a loser who would never amount to anything, and announcing her intention to marry Derek Walsh, a man she perceived as successful and powerful in contrast to my perceived mediocrity. Shocked murmurs rippled through the room. Several board members looked at Derek with open disgust. One of them, Margaret Chen, the chief financial officer, spoke up. She didn't know? All this time, your wife had no idea who you really were? She had no idea, Thomas confirmed, and neither did Derek. In fact, Derek sent me a text message on Saturday night after Lila told him she'd broken the news to me, offering to transfer me to the basement if working near him and my ex-wife would be too awkward. He found the entire situation amusing, enjoyed his perceived victory over a man he considered beneath him. Thomas pulled out his phone and projected the text message thread onto the large screen behind him, letting everyone in the room read Derek's cruel, mocking words. The vice president seemed to shrink in his chair, realizing that his casual cruelty had been directed at the one person who could destroy his career. Derek Walsh, Thomas said formally, turning to address the man directly, you are hereby terminated from Titanium Industries, effective immediately. Your behavior toward me was unprofessional enough, but I've been documenting your conduct for months. You take credit for other people's work. You treat subordinates with contempt. You manipulate reporting structures to hide your mistakes, and you create a toxic environment in every department you manage. The only reason you've lasted this long is because I wanted to see how far your ambition would take you, what lines you'd be willing to cross. Derek tried to speak, but no words came out. His career, his reputation, everything he'd built was dissolving in real time. You pursued my wife, not knowing she was my wife, Thomas continued. You convinced her to leave me, not knowing I was your employer. You mocked me in text messages, not knowing I controlled your future. Your judgment is spectacularly poor, Derek, and your character is fundamentally flawed. Security will escort you from the building within the hour. Your personal effects will be shipped to you. You're entitled to severance as specified in your contract, but I'd recommend you prepare for a very different life than the one you've been planning with my ex-wife. 2 security guards appeared at the boardroom door, clearly having been stationed there in anticipation of this moment. Derek stood slowly, his face a mask of devastation and humiliation. As he walked toward the door, he stopped next to Thomas's chair. She loved me, Derek said quietly, desperately. Lila loved me. That was real, even if everything else was a lie. Thomas looked up at him with something that might have been pity. Lila loved what she thought you represented: power, success, status, security. When she finds out you've been fired, when she realizes you're just another unemployed executive instead of the vice president who could give her everything she wanted, we'll see how real that love actually is. My guess? She'll be gone before the end of the week. Women who dump their husbands for being losers don't typically stick around when their new fiancés become losers themselves. Derek Walsh walked out of the boardroom a broken man, and Thomas felt no satisfaction in his destruction, only a kind of empty vindication. The board meeting continued, with Thomas officially stepping into his public role as chairman, discussing quarterly results and strategic initiatives. and all the normal business that had continued running smoothly, even while drama unfolded in the personal lives of its leadership. As the meeting was concluding, Catherine appeared in the doorway, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Reed," she said hesitantly, "Ms. Montgomery is outside. She's demanding to see you. She says it's an emergency." The board members exchanged glances, clearly curious about how this confrontation would unfold. Thomas considered sending Lila away, but decided that a final conversation was inevitable and might as well happen now, with witnesses, so there could be no confusion about what was said. "Send her in," Thomas said, and the room went completely silent in anticipation. Lila burst through the door seconds later, her face flushed and her eyes wild with panic. She was dressed in one of her power suits, the kind she wore when she wanted to intimidate or impress, but her composure was shattered. She stopped short when she saw Thomas sitting at the head of the table in an expensive suit, looking completely different from the man she'd humiliated 2 nights ago. "What the hell is going on?" Lila demanded, her voice shaking. "Someone just told me Derek was fired. They said you did it. They said you're the chairman. That's insane. That's impossible. You're just an associate. You're nobody." Thomas gestured to an empty chair. "Sit down, Lila. We should discuss this calmly." "I don't want to sit down," Lila shouted. "I want answers. How dare you get Derek fired just because I'm dumping you? That's vindictive and petty and probably illegal. I'll sue. I'll go to the press. I'll destroy you." Margaret Chen spoke up from her position at the table. "Ms. Montgomery, I'd strongly advise you to lower your voice and listen carefully to what's about to be explained to you. You're operating under significant misapprehensions about your situation." Lila turned her fury on Margaret. "Who even are you? Why are you in a board meeting? Why is any of this happening?" "I'm the chief financial officer," Margaret said calmly. "And I'm in the board meeting because I'm on the board, as is everyone else in this room except you and the security guards. We're here because Mr. Reed, your husband, called this meeting to reveal his identity as the founder and owner of Titanium Industries." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Lila's face went through a series of expressions, confusion giving way to disbelief, giving way to a dawning horror as the implications began to sink in. "That's not possible," Lila whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. She was looking at Thomas now, really seeing him for the first time, seeing the expensive suit and the confident posture, and the way everyone in the room deferred to him. "You can't be. You're Thomas Reed, the associate. You make $50,000 a year. You drive a 12-year-old car. You live in a tiny apartment. You can't afford anything. You're nobody." "I'm Thomas Reed, the billionaire," Thomas corrected gently. "I founded Titanium Industries 9 years ago, built it from nothing into what it is today. The apartment we lived in together is tiny because I chose to live there to maintain my cover. The car I drive is old because I chose to drive it for the same reason. The $50,000 salary I appear to make is what I pay myself publicly, while my actual compensation comes through ownership stakes and dividends that run into the hundreds of millions annually. Everything you thought you knew about me, about my situation, about my prospects, it was all a carefully constructed fiction designed to let me experience my own company from the ground level." Lila sat down heavily in the nearest chair, her legs apparently unable to support her. "But why? Why would you do that? Why would you hide this from me?" "Because I wanted to know if you could love me without the money," Thomas said simply. "I wanted to know if you valued me as a person or as a provider. I wanted to build a relationship based on genuine connection rather than financial security. I thought that if you could love me when you believed I was nobody, then I'd know that love was real. But I didn't love you when I thought you were nobody," Lila said, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I thought you were a failure. I thought you were holding me back. I thought Derek was better because he had success and power and everything you didn't have. Derek had success and power because I gave them to him," Thomas said. "Every promotion he received came from me. Every privilege he enjoyed was mine to grant. The man you thought was my boss was actually my employee and not a particularly good one. I've just fired him, Lila. Derek Walsh is unemployed as of this morning. The man you dumped your husband to marry, the man you thought would give you the life you deserved, he's now the loser you accused me of being." The color drained from Lila's face completely now, as the full scope of her mistake became clear. She'd destroyed her marriage, humiliated herself in front of her parents, announced her engagement to the entire company, all based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who held actual power. The billionaire had been sleeping next to her every night while she fantasized about escaping to marry his vice president. "I didn't know," Lila whispered, tears starting to stream down her face. "How could I have known? You never told me. You never gave me any indication. You let me believe you were a failure." "I never said I was a failure," Thomas corrected. "You decided that based on your own values and priorities. I gave you every opportunity to see past surface appearances, to value things other than job titles and salaries. You failed that test, Lila. You failed it spectacularly, and now you have to live with the consequences." Lila looked around the boardroom, seeing the judgment in every face, understanding that this story would spread through the company within hours, that she would become the woman who dumped a billionaire because she thought he was a loser. Her reputation would be destroyed. Her engagement would likely collapse once Derek realized how thoroughly he'd been deceived. And her parents would discover that they'd witnessed their daughter make the worst decision of her life. "What do you want from me?" Lila asked brokenly. "What do I have to do to fix this?" "Nothing," Thomas said quietly. "There's nothing to fix. You made your choice based on the information you had and the values you hold. I'm going to honor that choice. The divorce papers will be delivered to you tomorrow. You'll get everything you're legally entitled to from our marriage, which given my actual net worth is substantially more than you probably expected. You'll be comfortable, Lila. You just won't be married to me anymore." "But what if I don't want the divorce?" Lila said desperately. "What if I made a mistake? What if I want to stay married now that I know the truth?" Thomas looked at his wife, seeing the calculation behind her tears, the way she was already pivoting from Derek back to him now that she understood where real power lay. This was who Lila truly was, he realized. Someone who would calibrate her affection based on perceived advantage, who would dump her husband one day and beg to stay married the next, all depending on what served her interests in the moment. "You dumped your husband, Lila," Thomas said firmly. "You stood in your parents' dining room and called me a pathetic loser in front of your mother and father. You announced your engagement to Derek. You humiliated me publicly and privately. You don't get to take that back now that circumstances have changed. Your love isn't real. It never was. You loved what you thought Derek could give you, and now you love what you know I can give you. But you've never actually loved me. The divorce stands. We're done." Lila started to protest, but Margaret Chen stood up and gestured to the security guards. "Ms. Montgomery, this meeting is concluded. You need to leave now. If you attempt to contact Mr. Reed directly, it will be considered harassment and dealt with accordingly. All future communication should go through his attorneys." As security escorted a sobbing Lila from the boardroom, Thomas felt the weight of 5 years lift from his shoulders. The experiment was over. The test had been failed, but he was free now, free to be himself publicly, free to build a life without pretense or deception. He'd learned a hard lesson about the dangers of hiding who you really are, about the impossibility of building authentic relationships on foundations of lies, even lies told with good intentions. The story of what happened in the titanium industries boardroom that Monday morning spread through the company like wildfire, leaping from department to department, embellished and exaggerated with each retelling. By lunchtime, everyone knew that the quiet associate from the 14th floor was actually the billionaire owner, that he'd been hiding in plain sight for years, that his wife had dumped him for his boss not knowing the truth, that the boss had been fired and the wife had begged to be taken back. The gossip was merciless, the judgment swift, and the shock genuine. Lila's life unraveled exactly as Thomas had predicted. Derek broke off their engagement within 24 hours of his firing, unable to handle the humiliation of being revealed as the man who tried to steal his boss's wife. He left town entirely, relocating to another city where his failure at Titanium Industries wouldn't follow him quite so closely. Lila tried to stay at the company, but found the atmosphere impossible. Every conversation stopping when she entered a room, every glance carrying judgment or pity or schadenfreude. She resigned 2 weeks after the revelation and moved back in with her parents, Her engagement ring returned, her marriage ended, her reputation in ruins. Eleanor and Gerald Montgomery reached out to Thomas 1 month after everything fell apart. They invited him to dinner, just the three of them, and spent the evening apologizing for their daughter's behavior and mourning what might have been. Gerald admitted that he'd tried to warn Lila that night in the dining room, had tried to suggest that she didn't understand her situation fully, but she'd been too determined to listen. She got what she asked for, Gerald said sadly. She wanted to dump the man she perceived as a loser to marry the man she perceived as successful. When the perceptions proved false, she lost everything. That's justice of a sort, I suppose, but it's hard to watch your own child destroy herself so thoroughly. Thomas bore them no ill will. They'd raised Lila the best they could, but ultimately, everyone makes their own choices and lives with their own consequences. He signed the divorce papers without contest, gave Lila a settlement that set her up financially for life despite her betrayal, and moved on with his life as the public face of Titanium Industries. The media discovered the story, of course. It was too good not to cover. The billionaire who'd hidden among his own employees, the wife who'd left him not knowing what she was giving up, the boss who'd been fired for pursuing what he didn't know was his employer's spouse. Thomas gave one interview, carefully explaining his reasons for the undercover operation, discussing what he'd learned about corporate culture and employee experience, turning the personal drama into a business story about leadership and organizational understanding. He never mentioned Lila by name in the interview, never identified Derek specifically, protected their privacy even as their actions had destroyed his marriage. That was his final act of grace toward the woman who'd called him a loser, the quiet dignity of refusing to humiliate her further, even when he had every right to do so. A year later, Thomas Reed stood in the same boardroom where he'd revealed himself, looking out over the city that stretched to the horizon. Titanium Industries was thriving, its profits up, its culture improved by changes he'd implemented based on his undercover insights. He dated occasionally but cautiously, always aware now of the complications that came with his wealth and position. He'd learned to introduce himself honestly from the beginning, to let potential partners know exactly who he was, rather than testing them with deceptions they couldn't possibly prepare for. He heard from Gerald occasionally. The older man reported that Lila had moved to another city, had started over with a job in a small marketing firm, was trying to rebuild a life from the ashes of her mistake. Derek Walsh had disappeared entirely, his career in corporate leadership apparently over. The story had followed both of them, a cautionary tale that spread through professional networks about the dangers of hubris and misjudgment. Thomas didn't take satisfaction in their suffering. He'd learned that revenge, even justified revenge, doesn't heal the wounds that caused you to seek it. What he felt was something closer to sadness for what might have been if he'd made different choices, if she'd been a different person, if love had been enough to bridge the gap between appearance and reality. The lesson stayed with him, though, carved into his consciousness by the price he'd paid to learn it. You can't test someone's love by deceiving them. You can't build authentic relationships on foundations of lies. And you can't judge people for failing tests they don't know they're taking. Lila had failed him, yes, but he'd failed her too. Failed her by never giving her the chance to love the real version of him, by creating conditions where her worst instincts would flourish, while her better nature had no room to develop. In the end, what he did to her and to Derek had shocked everyone who witnessed it. But the real shock wasn't in the revelation or the firing or the humiliation. The real shock was in the mirror it held up to human nature, showing how easily love could turn to contempt, loyalty to betrayal, respect to dismissal, all based on incomplete information and mistaken assumptions about power, success, and worth. The story became a legend in business circles, a warning about the dangers of judging by appearances, a reminder that sometimes the person you dismiss as nobody actually controls everything, and the choices you make based on false perceptions can cost you more than you ever imagined possible.